So, we have got John Cutlack Martin, and he has just joined. And he was born in January 1827 to his parents, Henry Martin and Rebecca Cutlack. The Cutlack and Martin families have got an interesting history. Both of these families lived in Littleport, which is now part of Cambridgeshire, but then was considered the Isle of Ely. Despite the fact that Henry Martin and Rebecca Cutlack would not be married for another 2 years, the family clearly were well acquainted, and we know this because of some infamous riots. So, between the 22nd and 24th of May, 1816, 11 years before our John was born, there were riots which became known as the Ely and Littleport riots. These riots were caused by high unemployment and rising grain costs, similar to the general unrest which spread throughout England following the Napoleonic Wars. All gets a bit complicated here, but I'm going to do my best to explain it. On the 22nd of May, 1816, a group of 56 residents meet at the Globe Inn in Littleport to discuss the lack of work and rising grain costs. Fueled by alcohol, the residents directed their anger at local farmer Henry Martin. Henry had been an overseer of the poor in 1814, and he was not well liked by the parishioners. One man went to get a horn from Burgess, the lighterman, and he started blowing it outside the Globe Inn, gathering hundreds of villagers to join the first group, and the riot commenced. They went to the premises of Mrs. Rebecca Wadelow, an old lady of about 70 who lived with her grandson, Henry Martin. Henry saw the mob approaching, and he fled out the back of the house, leaving his 70-year-old grandmother and a visitor, Miss Rebecca Cutlack, to fend for themselves. The mob broke in the doors and windows and stormed the house. Rebecca Cutlack was robbed of £3, which is about £375 in 2023. All the furniture was smashed, and all the goods in the shop were taken, including property worth about £100 and £200, which now is between £8,000 to £16,000. The mob left after making death threats against Henry Martin. So, in simple terms, even though Henry and Rebecca aren't yet married and wouldn't be for another 2 years, on this night, Henry's 70-year-old grandma, Rebecca, and his 21-year-old wife-to-be, Rebecca, were together in a house when it was attacked. A group of villagers don't like Henry because he's a wealthy farmer, and not only that, he's the overseer of the poor. So they go and try and find him at his home, and he lives with his granny, despite the fact that his granny and his future wife are in the house together, and Henry sees the angry mob headed his way, and he legs it. His granny and his future wife have the house stormed, everything around them is smashed up, and his future wife, is robbed. The women were left with nothing but chaos and damage and death threat towards Henry. I can barely begin to imagine how terrified the two Rebeccas must have been, especially as Littleport was a small community, so everyone knew everyone else. However, in 1818, the 23-year-old Rebecca Cutlack loses her father, and shortly afterwards she marries the 28-year-old Henry Martin. John is the sixth child, so this is our John, is the sixth child to be born to the couple, but 3 of his siblings have died before John is born. Each of the deceased are boys, and none live for more than 3 weeks. John CM starts his working life following in his father's footsteps, and in the 1851 census he can be found working as a farmer for his father. The 1851 census gives us an insight into the Martin family finances again. The family owns a farm of 780 acres, employing 25 labourers. But John felt called by God to do something other than farming, and in 1853, at the age of 26, he starts as a fellow commoner at St Catherine's College, Cambridge. 4 years later, aged 30 in 1857, in Carlisle, he's ordained, and he takes up his curacy at Wroughton Head, Cumberland. However, less than a year later, he's been promoted, and he becomes the domestic chaplain to the Bishop of Carlisle. The Bishop of Carlisle must have seen John's potential to elevate him so quickly. We can only speculate how the word reached Carlisle about a strange church and a circus down on the south coast having issues with clergy. But word did reach them, and in November 1858, less than a year after ordination and a few months after promotion, John was deployed to the circus church. The next two big life events for John came in 1869 when he was aged 42. In August, his father Henry died, aged 80. At the time of his death, Henry was regarded as the father of agriculture and the mentor of public men. He had the most valuable land in the Isle of Ely, and on top of that, he was a magistrate and had served the office of High Sheriff for the county of Cambridge. Henry's will states that he left his 5 sons a value of £49,261. In today's money, that's worth about £7.5 million. Assuming that this money was divided equally between John and his brothers, he would have received the equivalent of about £1.5 million. Life-changing money at any point, but remember that he was now living and working amongst some of the poorest and most deprived people in the United Kingdom at the time. In October 1869, 2 months after his father's death, the 42-year-old John marries the 43-year-old Anne Sophia Westcott Lawrence, the first marriage for both of them. Those cynics amongst us might have thought that Anne was marrying John for the money, but in actual fact, Anne's father was a Royal Marine, Captain John Westcott Lawrence, and he died in 1857, leaving her £400, which is worth about £43,500 today. Anne was still living at home with her widowed mother, who had been more than adequately provided for. Anne had been born in Portsmouth and was still living there at the time of her marriage to John, so potentially she had come across him in his work with the circus church. Anne and John spent 28 years living at Rathmines Villa, 33 Elm Grove, Southsea, until she dies in 1899, aged 72. When Anne dies, she leaves everything she has to John, and what she leaves him is £6,000, which is worth about £1 million today. Widowed, aged 72, it wouldn't have been surprising if he had remained that way until his own death. However, joyfully, John remarries again, aged 75, in 1902 to a lady named Jane Elliott. Jane was born to a wealthy land-owning family in Scotland, but at the time of her marriage, she's living in the Langham Hotel in Westminster, London. Jane has never been previously married when she marries John, despite being 47 years old. There was still a 28-year gap between the two of them. Again, it could cynically be thought that this was a marriage for money. But looking into Jane's family finances, I don't think it was. I don't know how John and Jane met. And if it's to be found out, I haven't found it out yet. But they did meet, and they got married at All Souls Langham Place, Westminster. Yes, I've got a family link there. I don't know why they didn't marry at the circus church, but Jane moves into the home John and Anne had shared in Elm Grove, Southsea. 2 years after his second marriage, while still serving at the circus church, John died at home on the 15th of April 1904 of an infected throat. He left in his will £17,547, or £2.7 million today. This money was divided between his wife and 2 of his brothers. I know that I have completely leapt through John Cutler Martin's life, and I've talked a lot about money. But for John Cutler Martin and for his finances, they changed the outcome of the circus church completely and its entire legacy, and it may not have survived beyond 1863, but for him. So for this next section of the talk, I'm actually going to pass over to some of the words which were written in 1924 for the Circus Church Diamond Jubilee Anniversary booklet, which is just on that final page there. So this is what it says. This is it abridged, don't worry, I'm not reading the whole thing. Advent of the Reverend John Martin. Mr. Knapp was joined by the Reverend John Cutlack Martin, and they laboured together for 4 years until a climax arose. The wooden building, which had to constantly be repaired, was becoming unsafe, and in consequence of this, Mr. Knapp, not wishing to incur any further responsibility, resigned the supervision of the entire work into the hands of Mr. Martin. At a meeting held at the circus on September the 15th, 1863, when the people assembled considering what should be done for the future, it was unanimously resolved that another building should be erected, capable of holding 1,600 to 2,000 people, with a schoolroom, that the services should be carried on at present, if possible, and that half the sittings should be free if sufficient funds were raised. It was thought desirable that the building should be entirely in the hands of Mr. Martin, who had bought the ground for its site at a cost of £550, that's about £88,000 today, and who has agreed to advance £450, approximately £72,000, more if required, and to render himself liable for £500, approximately £80,000, if requisite. Mr. Martin subsequently executed a deed whereby, at his death, 7 trustees were appointed with absolute power to maintain the evangelical truth independent of any so-called church upon earth. For those of us who have been trying to find out stuff about this land, these are the Circus Church trustees of whom we know so much. So, the site in Surrey Street was bought, and it was estimated that the new building would cost £2,600, approximately £418,000. Almost at once, the congregation raised a sum of £500 and worked with such a will that a new church was opened on December the 28th, 1864. To walk between the two churches is a grand total of about 170 yards. I tested it out. So for those of you who know the area, if you know Commercial Street and you know where the NatWest building is, there's the road turn, it's got a corner on it, and if you stand kind of at the NatWest, the Circus Church, this new one, was just in what is now the car park, so just behind the NatWest building, and the original one, you turn round and it's literally there. So very, very close to each other. So what was this new Circus Church like inside? Again, I refer you to the anniversary booklet, which describes it as, it describes the pulpit was a very high structure, a double-decker. The reading desk at the bottom and the stand for the preacher at the top. It appears that Mr. Martin raised a mild protest against this, but the architect said, "No, Martin, not for you or anyone else will I lower that pulpit. If it is lowered, it will spoil the whole look of the church, and the people in the gallery will be unable to see you." Although Mr. Martin was now the recognised incumbent of the church, the opening ceremony was performed at his request by the Reverend John Knapp, who preached the first sermon in the new building, and Mr. Martin preached on the following Sunday. In the book, Churches, Chapels and Places of Worship on Portsea Island by John Offord, it's over there if anyone wants to have a look, we get an excellent description of what the new permanent Circus Church building was like. It stood back from the street and presented an austere brick facade with studio pediment. Right, so the pictures you can see here are the sepia one is a picture, and that was sort of from the time. The next one, where you can see the NatWest bank sort of lower bit, that is where it would have been. You can see that some of the buildings, so you can see that the original ones are still there. The Circus Church is not there for reasons we will come up with later. Yes, if we go back to what people may make as moral judgments, of which I am not making moral judgments, but you will see that actually next to the original Circus Church, there is a lap dancing club now. And next to where the Circus Church originally was, is still is, was, a pub. So I kind of think that's quite interesting. But anyway, so it goes on to describe in the book, a gallery went round 3 sides with the organ in recess above the holy table. The 10 Commandments were inscribed on the boards behind the table. A lectern stood in the centre. The walls were painted green below the dado and yellow above. It seated 1,700. A mission chapel was later established in Durham Street. It was a small corrugated iron building where a layman conducted the services. In 1937, the aisles were converted into a hall, kitchen, toilets, etc., an early example of a subdivision of a church. The churchmanship was severely evangelical from the start, with matins and evensong the Sunday norm. The minister wore a Geneva gown for preaching, and the ladies and the gentlemen at the choir were not robed. An evening celebration of the Lord's Supper occurred once or twice per month. So, the work continued to grow under the guidance of Mr. Martin, and further buildings, including a day school, were added as circumstances demanded. Right. Now, do you ever wish that you'd stood slightly to the left to take a picture? But I couldn't go back. So, what we can see here is an original view from Commercial Road looking down into Surrey Street. And on the left-hand side, that building with the kind of towery bit is, and I know it's quite tricky to see, but that is the new Circus Church. The picture with the bin and the bus stop is taken from Google Images because the picture I took was completely in the wrong place. And that is what it looks like now, so coming from that area. And I've just kind of left the other bit of the original black and white. So if you're wondering what you're looking at, that's what you're looking at. So, the whole time that John Cutler Martin was working, he declined to take home any pay for his work. The Pastoral Aid Society granted him a sum of £50 a year, which was about that works out about £8,000 in 2023. And he said, I take it because I feel like I've earned it, but I hand it over intact to Mr. Knapp for a scripture reader to help me in work. John Cutler Martin continued working for the Circus Church until his death in 1904, a period of 42 years, in which time he had not only bought the land, he had paid for the church, and he had taken no wages. In the Jubilee booklet, which is the following is printed after the death of John Cutler Martin. He leaves a memory which is deeply revered, and this can be shown in no better way than to quote a letter from the town clerk of Nelson, New Zealand, who claims Circus Church as his spiritual home. I have never ceased to remember the blessings I received there, and to thank God for the influence which my early training in the church and Sunday school has had upon my life. I have a photo of dear old Mr. Martin, whom as a boy I almost worshipped, and who as a man I reverenced. To me he was, and always will be, the best pattern of a sainted life that I have ever known. When John Cutler Martin died, the whole community were devastated, and they commissioned and erected a Sicilian marble memorial tablet, which was put up in the church building, being unveiled in December 1904. We have this tablet, and it reads as follows. In loving and grateful memory of the Reverend John Cutler Martin, M.A., the founder of this church and the adjacent schools, who, for upwards of 40 years, preached here faithfully and graciously the gospel of the free and sovereign grace of God. This tablet is erected by his bereaved congregation. Long his ministry was singularly characterized by fidelity to the evangelical and Protestant principles spiritually maintained in the XXXLX Articles of the Reformed Church of England. His experimental proclamation of the blessed doctrine of justification by faith is in Christ crucified, adjoined by a consistent life, was richly owned by the Holy Spirit in the salvation of sinners and in the establishment, bless you, of believers. This tender sympathy and care for spirituality, exercised souls, was the fruit of a deep personal experience. He departed to be with Christ April 15th, 1904, aged 77 years, whose faith follow Hebrews. Now, if you don't immediately know what that Bible verse from Hebrews says in full, you're not alone. The NIV translates it. Oh, I've not put it up there. Oh, yes, I have. It's up at the top. It translates it as, remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Which I think is a pretty, I'd be happy to have that on mine. Take note. So I'm going to hop, skip and jump over the next few years to the Circus Church as written in their anniversary book. Again, I've abridged it, but we would be here all day. So after John Cutlack Martin's death, he was succeeded by the Reverend A.J. Day until 1917. The Reverend Horace Silverter carried on the work for 5 years, and during that time he had the double-decker pulpit cut in half, and the sections were disposed in a convenient manner in the church. I don't know what that means, but... Then, the Reverend Peacock, M.A., B.D., is now the spiritual leader of this congregation. This Bible here that we use every week, week in, week out, is dedicated to the memory of Reverend Peacock. In the front of it, I've left it so it's turned open there. It has a memory, it has a dedication from his family and from the Circus Church for us here at St. John's. Most people would never have looked at it. I hadn't looked at it. So that's just a little thing for you there. So it was in November 1924, not long after the Circus Church Diamond Jubilee, that the Reverend Frederick Peacock dies. In 1939, 15 years after the Circus Church held their Diamond Jubilee celebrations, there was need to celebrate further. The building, which had been purchased by John Cutlack Martin's funds, had been well used since 1863, but the time had come and it was in need of reparation and modernisation. The congregation banded together and with the help of the diocese restored the Circus Church. The Portsmouth Evening News on the 8th of July 1939 describes the updates as follows. The Circus Church has been entirely reconstructed, restored and beautified almost beyond recognition internally. There are multicoloured lit lights lending charm and dignity to the whole building. New seating for 1,200 people. Oak woodwork, 8 windows made of Flemish hammered glass with green and amber borders. New heating, lighting, carpeting, a new organ from London, as well as new prayer books, Bibles, service books, silk gowns, communion table, and new chairs for the sewing room. Sounds like it was spectacular. I don't know if there are any pictures of it. I haven't found any. This is a picture from before it was done up. Now, you might have noticed the date that the restoration was finished, July 1939. It was a mere 2 months later that World War II began and life changed for everyone. On the evening of January the 10th, / the morning of January the 11th, 1941, Portsmouth was decimated. Portsmouth Cathedral write the following in their blog. By Friday the 10th of January 1941, Portsmouth had already endured an autumn and winter of frequent nighttime raids. Then, on Saturday the 11th of January 1941, the cathedral service register reads, "During this night, Portsmouth was heavily raided and much of the parish was destroyed." The 10th and 11th of January, in what was the city's 31st raid, more than 300 bombs fell on the city. 171 people were killed, 430 injured. I'll just wait for the skateboarders to go. And 3,000 people were made homeless that night. Except for a lull, the air raid was spread over a period of 7 hours. St. John the Evangelist, Portsea, so John Knapp's home church, the church that he had come down to Portsmouth and had been built in 1789, was destroyed completely that evening. So that's a picture there, one from the news and one from taken before. The newly renovated Circus Church was very badly damaged. One article notes that not one pew in the whole of the church building, which was constructed to seat 2,000 people, was left undamaged. The organ was destroyed. Registers of weddings and baptisms were lost. The latest vicar, Richard Reverend Talbot's vicarage, was also ruined, burnt and blasted. However, he says, so this is the Reverend, he says that the fact that touched him about the disaster was that just after the fire blitz, as he approached the church, he was met by a fireman who shouted, We have saved the new Bible and prayer book. Sadly, this prayer book seems to have been mislaid, but I believe it was in residence here at St John's until at least the mid-1980s. However, we do still have the stand upon which this book stood. So, this stand has been out in our foyer for as long as I've been coming, and much before that, and I've never looked at it before. And when you look at it, and please, I encourage you to come and look at it afterwards, you can see that it's not just shoddy workmanship, which is actually what I thought it was. This has been burnt. This was rescued from the fire in the church in January 1941, and presumably it was the stand that had the Bible on it. And now this small, unassuming bit of wood stand is now quite possibly one of my favourite pieces of furniture. Don't worry, it's not coming home. The article finishes with the following. Mr. Talbot has only one comment to make on the destruction of the church and of his vicarage, and that takes the form of a story concerning a lad of 14 who assists the firemen who are trying to hack a way through the window to the vicar's blazing study. The boy, said Mr. Talbot, picked up a stout piece of timber and struck the window frame full in the centre. Away went glass, frame and everything. It did the trick, though. That's splendid, I told him. His reply was to put his hand on my shoulder and say consolingly, "Never mind, Mr. Talbot, you've got your life." Following the damage to the circus church, the congregation moved to worship alongside the parishioners of St Luke's Church in Greetham Street, which was just up the road and which hadn't been damaged. St Luke's let them erect a temporary structure on their land, and all the bits of furniture they could salvage from the circus were stored there. In February 1949, aged 80, the Reverend Richard Henry Talbot died, having been an incumbent at the circus church for 20 years, his wife Emma having died the year before. Reverend Talbot's funeral was held in the remains of the circus church, which had been temporarily converted into a chapel for the occasion. Only 80 people could crowd into the tiny chapel, but many more parishioners attended the interment at Highland Road Cemetery. After Richard Talbot had died, the circus church reached a turning point. The city of Portsmouth was very different. Many families had been displaced from the city centre into the surrounding areas, and here they had gardens and modern facilities. So while some buildings were being repaired or replaced, the demographics of Portsmouth were quite different than what they had been before. When plans for the restoration of Portsmouth were being drawn up, it became clear to the circus church congregation that they felt God calling them to evolve. The cost of renovation was too high, and churches such as St Luke's were able to offer the people a place to worship and have their needs met. In 1950, the land on which the bombed circus church stood was sold to what was then the National Provincial Bank for £10,500, which is now about 460 grand. A plaque now stands on the site of the former church in Surrey Street. There it is. Oh yeah, I went and found it. So it's in NatWest's car park, but if you ask them very nicely, they sometimes let you in. I think the guy thought I was crazy. The trustees of the circus church approached the bishop, Lancelot Fleming, who was the Bishop of Portsmouth, and they asked him if he thought the money should be used to build a church in one of the suburbs. The trustees of the circus church, one of the places which was growing following the movement from Portsmouth was Fareham. In Fareham, during the 1940s, a large estate was being created, initially known as the West End Garden Estate, and now more commonly known as West End. The bishop, having his home in Fareham, we were in his back garden, knew the West End development well, and he suggested that the money from the circus church could be used to fund an evangelical church here, an Anglican evangelical church. In March 1951, after 94 years of service, the circus church in Portsmouth held its last service, as reported in the local papers. Speaking at that final church service, the Bishop of Portsmouth is quoted as following: "The real story is woven into the stuff of men's lives. This service marks the closing of this church, and at first that might appear to be a sad necessity. Indeed, such are the sentimental ties that bind us by association to places and buildings. It's human nature to feel grief when the doors are shut on one's spiritual home. There is no question of the church retreating. Rather, it is advancing to meet new needs and new opportunities. And I am happy that has been in your minds facing the future of the circus church. The plans are well advanced to make the material resources available from the circus church for the building of a new church life at West End Fareham. That is the kind of advancing that the church in our land must strive to make. To go to the people where they are and meet man's spiritual lives in new surroundings. The church in which we now stand is named St. John the Evangelist Church, after the destroyed Prince George Street Church, the building which first brought John Knapp and his family to Portsea. The building that was there is now destroyed, but there is a play park alongside a block of flats, and the building commemorates the history of the site with a blue plaque by the front entrance. And so, St. John's was built here, in what is one of the most deprived areas locally. Like the circus church, we open our doors and extend a welcome to people of all backgrounds. We host a debt centre, the CMA Debt Centre, born of a vision to help the poorest in our community. As we at St. John's wrestle with our own finances and the future of this church building, we do well to know our history and upon whose shoulders we stand. The men whose stories we can tell, and the sideline women whose voices are silenced, but without whom their partners could not have achieved what they did. The history of this church speaks of a people answering the needs of their community in the social atmosphere at the time, with Jesus in the heart of the community. As John Knapp proved by opening a church in a circus, for us, it has never been about the buildings, but rather demonstrating the power of God's love to all. And I am a proud child of the circus.